They were looking for something that could be that carrot, that hook, right? So they wanted to, bring someone into a sales demo or a webinar or just get the conversation started. So they needed a good hook. And having a virtual tasting was an excellent hook. So we were able to work with these clients and incorporate this into their programs, right? So this could be as simple as just doing a tasting. It could be a tasting integrated with Q&As, things of that nature. And we start building these programs with clients. My marketing background came in pretty handy because we helped them as they would write the recruitment pieces to get people into these meetings. We would read behind, we would add content. But our tastings were really cool because they not only just came in and sample through whiskey, because it really wasn't about that. It was about giving people an engaging experience that was memorable.
Welcome back to another episode of the Sales Gravy Podcast. On this episode, I'm with Pops Garrett. And let me tell you something. I've been waiting a long time to get on this podcast. We've been trying to schedule this since the summer because you've probably never heard of this before, but Pops is a chief drinking officer. And it turns out that he likes bourbon and I like bourbon. So on this episode, Pops and I are probably going to drink some bourbon since he's a chief drinking officer. And Pops is the founder and CEO of a company called DrinkCurious. So we're going to talk a little bit about what he does and how he helps sales teams sell more. But before we get started, two things. I want you to go check out Sales Gravy University. Sales Gravy University is where salespeople and sales teams from across the globe come to learn how to sell more. And if you've never taken a course on Sales Gravy University, you can take one right now using the code FREECOURSE at learn.salesgravy.com. That's learn.salesgravy.com. And second thing, if you like this podcast, tell somebody. You are our entire marketing budget. That means that we count on you for word of mouth. And Pops is going to count on you for word of mouth too. You're going to want to tell your friends about this particular podcast. But also go wherever you listen to podcasts, give this podcast a 5-star review. It helps pop us up in the algorithms and it lets more people know about us. Pops Garrett, Chief Drinking Officer. Tell us a little bit about the company DrinkCurious, because I got to tell you, this caught my eye and I'm loving this.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me on the show today. And I know we had a little bit of time to get to here, but you know what? It's always worth, waiting to have the right time to have a drink. So DrinkCurious is a spirits tasting company that I launched during COVID. One of the few people that probably had a silver lining that came out of that time. But back in 2011, I had launched a whiskey review website called bourbonbanter.com. And it was a hobby of mine, a passion project, if you will. I I recruited people, became one of the top 10 global bourbon websites, and had a lot of fun doing that. And meanwhile, I worked in advertising. And during COVID, as things started to shift, people started to reach out asking for a virtual tasting solution. No longer could they get face to face with people, have a drink, get to know them, spend time. They needed an alternative. And spirit tastings was something that everybody was interested in. So we figured out a way how to do that. And then I had an opportunity with the company I was with to either take on a new role or move on. And I decided to go ahead and roll the dice based on the success of what we were doing. And I officially launched DrinkCurious in February of 2021. And as I like to say, advertising drove me to drink, and I finally learned how to monetize it.
So tell us a little bit about DrinkCurious, what you do, and just a little bit about how you're able to help sales teams now with their customers getting attention, and it sounds like you also have a process that's just helping salespeople understand bourbon a little bit more. And I know a lot of my clients love bourbon. I was on a sales call with out in Tulsa just recently, and we walked into the office of the CEO of this big construction company, and he had this entire wall of bourbon, and we got into a conversation with it. And fortunately for me, I knew just enough, just enough to be dangerous, but it would have been nice to have known a lot more because I could have carried on a much deeper conversation with him.
Yeah, as people start reaching out, they were looking for something to, once again, this started in the virtual realm route. They were looking for something that could be that carrot, that hook, right? So they wanted to, bring someone into a sales demo or a webinar or just get the conversation started. So they needed a good hook. And having a virtual tasting was an excellent hook. So we were able to work with these clients and incorporate this into their programs, right? So this could be as simple as just doing a tasting. It could be a tasting integrated with Q&As, things of that nature. And we start building these programs with clients. My marketing background came in pretty handy because we helped them as they would write the recruitment pieces to get people into these meetings. We would read behind, we would add content. But our tastings were really cool because they not only just came in and, sampled through whiskey, because it really wasn't about that. It was about giving people an engaging experience that was memorable. In this sense, we educate them heavily about bourbon. We teach them how to taste it, talk about the different grains. We really kind of get in depth with that. And as a result, people became very engaged. They start spreading word of mouth. They start giving our clients feedback that this was hands down the best virtual tasting or event they'd ever been to. And as you know, when that happens, word of mouth starts spreading, right? And we start getting more and more people requesting this. And a lot of the people that were attendees reached out and started wanting to actually host these for themselves. And so in that virtual world, it sort of became the go-to hook to attract people, because then we start finding out it was increasing registrations, actually improving actually how many people showed up, and the throughput. They would stay to the end, not to mention then the rapport and the trust that it would build downstream to help further the sales cycle.
Is it something that, for example, holidays are coming up and I wanted to give a holiday present to some of my top clients? Would this be a good holiday gift, a virtual tasting for my client's team that I could actually attend and enjoy with them?
Oh, absolutely. Clients use this for a variety of things. They use it not only for prospecting, but they use it for employee rewards. They use it for client retention. So inviting people to this is a fantastic way to thank someone for them, because it's a personal experience that doesn't require everybody to get in one place. And once again, the nice thing is we can also do these virtually, but then we can also record them, right? We give all of our clients the abilities to record it. So if anybody has to miss it, something comes up, they can jump in at a later time and get the full value out of it and continue the conversation.
What got you into bourbon?
Great question. So I'm from St. Louis, born and raised, and the height of drinking culture in St. Louis was either Anheuser-Busch or Seven and Sevens. And when I got involved in the advertising world and started traveling, I worked for a company called Group M, and we were the single largest buyer of paid digital media inside of Google and Facebook. And so I would go to New York, twice a month, entertain clients along with those media vendors, and these would be 3-4 hour dinners, lots of drinking. And as I got into my 30s, I realized that the mornings were getting a little bit harder, not hungover, but a little leftover. And I found out sugar was not my friend. I should have known that based on my physique, but sugar was the problem. So I dove in, did research, and said, okay, I need to find something I can drink that doesn't involve sugar. I didn't want to be the person drinking a rum and Diet Coke and looking for Diet 7 Up. I tried Scotch first. Unfortunately, I tried the wrong Scotch first. I went in the PD end of the pool, and
Yes.
that backfired on
That
me.
will mess you up.
Then yeah, that's what will. I like it now, but back then I wasn't ready for it. Then I tried bourbon, and although it wasn't love at first sip, I didn't dislike it. So I kept drinking it a little bit, and a couple months later, my wife bought me 4 bottles for Christmas, and that sort of cemented the deal. So then I kind of got into a little bit more, and I started talking to people at work about it. And every time I would experience somebody who drank bourbon, they would start whispering. And they're like, "You drink bourbon? I drink bourbon. We should drink bourbon together." And I was like, "Why the heck are we whispering?" It was a lot of people thought if you drank bourbon, this is, 15 years ago, you had a problem. But I found more and more people. And then we started Bourbon Club at work. And that was the foundation of what we did. So I just kind of took to it eventually. And like any hobby, my wife says, there isn't a hobby that I can't make into a business. I went off the deep end and dug in.
I got into bourbon because of the Scotch tariffs. So I come from a Scottish background, love Scotch, and I really don't like PD Scotch. I'm a Highland Scotch drinker. I've never really liked PD Scotch, uh, but and my favorite Scotch is the Balvenie. I love it. I've been there. We've gone on Scotch tours, and they just got so expensive. The Scotch has gone up almost 50% in cost, if not more. My favorite scotches have gotten to the point where I can't even stomach buying them. It's just too expensive. So I started drinking bourbon. Now bourbon is starting to go up in price as well, because I don't know and you can maybe help me understand the stampede into bourbon, because there was a point where bourbon was really inexpensive. Even really good bourbons were just affordable. Many of those bourbons now are starting to reach into the stratosphere, just like Scotch is. Some of them just because they get popular and everybody goes to them. But when the tariffs hit Scotch, and I think there was a lot of interest in Scotch in Asia, so you get a supply and demand issue. It sort of pushed me away from Scotch into bourbon, and I've really, I mean, I've thrown myself into it. Probably not like you have. I've got a couple of favorites, and they're not really interesting favorites. But I like Scotch. I mean, I bourbon and water basically, and with some
Mhm.
ice. It's my favorite. Uh, but I'm wondering if maybe you can help us understand the just this how the wave of interest moved into bourbon, because it seems like in my local liquor store the bourbon aisle gets bigger and bigger, and there's more and more selections, and it's getting harder and harder to figure out what's worth paying for and what's not worth paying for.
No, spot on with your observation of how things are shifting. Bourbon obviously was very affordable. And, one of the things that we cover in our tasting is this bourbon timeline, right? And the way that the history of bourbon is woven into American culture in some key moments is pretty fascinating. But when we think about bourbon consumption, as we got into the 60s, people stopped drinking bourbon. A couple things key happened. A lot of GIs who had come back from World War II continued to have a preference for Scotch, much like yourself initially. Counterculture, people didn't want to drink with their parents and grandparents drank, so it was more Scotch, more wine, more vodka. And as a result, bourbon sales declined. That was really the end of the golden age of bourbon as we got into there. That was the first time that producers start saying older bourbon was better because they were stuck with a glut of rapidly aging bourbon and an impending tax deadline. And so they were trying to dump and get rid of that at bourbon. Up until then, everybody bottled their bourbon between 4 and 8 years old. Old was eight; it was considered old. Even this continued into the 70s, into the 80s. We had a couple attempts at premiumizing the world of bourbon. We had, Blanton's, the first commercially
Yeah.
available single barrel, was created. We had the small batch collection created at Beam by Booker No as a way to get people excited about bourbon again. But still, even up to 1999, when the Bourbon Trail was created, bourbon was very much looked down upon by a lot of people. And a couple things happen. I talk about the fact that bartenders, right? They get bored, right?
Yeah.
They're kind of always looking for the next thing, and all these flavored vodkas and all these cosmopolitans. They got bored, so they hit the history books. And fortunately for us, those were whiskey history books because the history of cocktails are really rooted around whiskey.
Yes.
Rye, bourbon, Irish whiskey, things of that nature. So they not only hit those books and sort of dove in, but they then start making their own shrubs, their own bitters, their own syrups. And they brought us, the consumer, along for the ride. And they went from being bartenders to mixologists. And that started a trend. You had things like that great docudrama, Mad Men, right?
Yeah.
Which brought back nostalgia for day drinking, bad
And
behavior, and
yeah,
cocktail parties.
and you by the way
And
cannot watch Mad Men and not have a bourbon. Like it's impossible to have those
absolutely,
two things together. Not to have those two things
absolutely.
together.
And so suddenly people are buying, Dorothy Thorpe's, silver tip
Yeah.
glasses, vintage ice buckets, throwing cocktail parties. So those things helped tremendously. But I think the biggest impact was Kentucky. First of all, started to appreciate a little bit more bourbon. Right? They always appreciated the taxes, but always kind of turned their back on it a little bit. But I think the bourbon industry itself did itself a huge favor, and they start realizing they going to have to look what wine and Scotch were doing. Wine and Scotch for years have been talking about this idea of pairing with food, pairing with desserts, appreciation, not just drinking, if you will. And so the bourbon industry start paying a little bit more attention to that. And suddenly you were having pairing dinners, seminars, education, samplings. And that went a long way to changing attitudes on bourbon. When I launched Bourbon and Banter in 2011, we did a VIP trip. Which had never been done by anyone of note, that gave us behind the scenes access. And then within 24 months, um, the whole thing had taken off. And that's not to say we started it, but it was right at that time where people start getting interested in it. And as a result, it was affordable. It was something close. You didn't have to travel to Scotland to take it all in, or Ireland, or whatever it may be. And everybody loves a good story, and there are a lot of stories in it. So you could go to the Bourbon Trail, start drinking it, and there was a lot of that good old bourbon available. So a lot of people would hunt this down and raid old liquor
Yeah.
stores, and that got the first wave of people into bourbon.
Well, but if you think about whiskey itself, and you've got rye, you've got bourbon, you've got Scotch, and maybe you can help us understand when we say whiskey. I know that it's a shifting terminology, but but whiskey is built into the American soul. I mean, it is woven into our entire history. The very first action of citizens against the government was the Whiskey Rebellion that was Western Pennsylvania, and it was the only time in our history where the U.S. president led an army into war, essentially against its own citizens. Fortunately, it fizzled out nicely,
Right.
but but coming out of that, that's where the whiskey production essentially moved into Kentucky, because when the rebellion was in Pennsylvania, a lot of the people there that were making whiskey just to avoid the getting sideways with the government began to move south. And there's so much history around, and I don't think a lot of people really understand or remember from their history classes the whiskey rebellion, because I remember when I was in school, it was about that much time we spent on
Oh
it.
yeah.
But it's really deep, and how it changed our country. But whiskey was essentially the way that farmers could take their crops and package them up into something that was non-perishable, and then turn those crops into money, was basically it. And the government from the very get-go looked at that and said, well, we can tax that, and people got mad about it. It created America, and it's interesting to see how bourbon has come back as a force. But I didn't realize that it had died off in the '60s because people thought it was old fashioned.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, everything's cyclical, right? But you're absolutely right. I mean, whiskey is ingrained into the culture, and when you think about any civilization, right, it's always the farmers. These are the distillers, going all the way back in the history. And when our country first, started as a colony, we were rum drinkers, and we drank a lot of rum. We drank a lot of beer because the water quite literally could kill you, right? Water
Yeah.
wasn't safe, and people drank a lot. When we went to war with the British, we lost access to the rum roots, so we turned to our local farmers. Rye is what grew really well in the colonies area. So we were rye drinkers. And once again, to set the context, this is unaged whiskey, right? This is clear. This
Yeah.
is hot. This is rough. It's not exactly moonshine, but it's the closest comparison you can get there, right? Very much to the whiskey rebellion. There was already a lot of people moving to the frontier in Kentucky. So there was already sort of this movement there, but that, accelerated and had more people move there. And you're right. They kept distilling. They use it to trade, the barter. But at that point in time, what started happening was they also start making it and shipping it elsewhere, right? And so that's where sort of we have this legend of like, how did we start making it a product that was aged in a barrel, right? So there's a lot of cool things that come out of that. But I think one of the most insightful history things to tell you about how important whiskey was is there was the Bottled and Bond Act of 1897, which was the first ever, in hindsight, the first ever consumer protection law ever passed in this country, right? It created a standard for bourbon to know that the bourbon you were getting was properly aged, it was safe to drink, nothing was going to harm you in it. That was 9 years before the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed, right? So for our country, booze has always been central. Which is, I think, one of the things, the inner historian of me loves it so much. And these are the stories that allow us to weave these into these tastings and get people so excited about it.
And for all the students of history, the father of alcohol taxation is Alexander Hamilton, the Federalist. And so if you start thinking about states' rights versus federal rights, which we're still fighting over today, it began with Alexander Hamilton and the Whiskey Rebellion and taxing whiskey. Let's talk real quickly about whiskey, because I'm curious. You've got Scotch, and
Mhm.
you've got rye, and you've got bourbon, and then I know the Japanese are making some interesting whiskeys, and I think that they're actually hauling peat and barley over from Scotland to create their own.
Mhm.
It's so popular over there. I was in Japan trying to get into a whiskey tour, had a 2-year waiting period to get in,
Wow.
and the Japanese Suntory, for example, has bought a lot of distilleries and across the globe, and will continue to do so. But can you help us understand the difference between a Scotch, a rye, and a bourbon, and the different taste profiles of those different whiskeys?
Sure, absolutely. So starting with bourbon, bourbon is actually probably the most regulated type of whiskey around, right? There's very specific rules. The first one is has to be made in the United States. It's a protected term, just like Scotch has to be made in Scotland, cognac, champagne. But a lot of people think it can only be made in Kentucky. And so the truth is, it can be made anywhere in the US. 85 to 90% is made in Kentucky. And of course, they're the founders of it, so to speak. So they deserve all the praise they can get. But there's over 2,500 plus distilleries now in the US, up from 250 10 years ago, making a lot of great bourbon, whiskey, ryes, gins, you name it, are going out there. Next, bourbon has to have at least 51% corn in its mash bill or its grain recipe, right? We can use anything after that, but that corn helps give bourbon its big, bold signature flavor that we know and love. Next, it has to be aged in a brand new charred oak barrel. Okay, so these barrels have to be charred before they're used. And then once they're dumped out to be bottled, those barrels can never be used to make bourbon again. So we ship the lion's share over to Scotland and Ireland, who like to use used barrels. They love bourbon barrels. And then we use them to age beer, wine, hot sauce, coffee beans, you name it. Even make furniture out of them. There's some rules around distillation, distill no higher than 160 proof, which creates a heavy flavor compared to Scotch and Irish. We put it into the barrel at no more than 125 proof. And then when we bottle it, it has to be 80 proof or higher. So if you follow those rules, you're making bourbon. And I think I like the great story that Jimmy Russell, who is the retired master distiller at Wild Turkey, who actually just celebrated his 70th year working and associated with the distillery, says you can take a brand new bucket, put a fire in it, put the fire out, carry it over to the still, fill it up, carry it to the table, and what you have in there will be whiskey or will be bourbon. Just won't be very good, right? So that's what makes bourbon. Rye, okay, follows all of those same rules. The key difference is rye has to be 51% rye grain in the recipe instead of corn. Everything else is going to be the same. Now you shift gears and get to something like Scotch. Okay, obviously Scotch has to be made in Scotland. It has to be aged for a minimum of 3 years. It's once again going to be matured in wood, but it doesn't have to be a brand new barrel. All right. The biggest difference is most Scotch, especially single malts, right, are going to be 100% malted barley. Is going to be the primary grain. You do get into blended Scotches, which will have some column distilled whiskey made from other grains like wheat or rye that can be added in for the blending purposes. But really, the big signature flavor that comes out of Scotch is going to be that malted barley.
Mm-hmm.
And because of the distillations, because of the grains used, because of the blending techniques, short of a Scotch that has been peated, which has got that heavy, smoky iodine flavor, Scotches are going to have a lot more lighter notes, fruity, if you will, versus bourbons, which are going to be much more oak forward, vanilla, and caramel. So those are going to be some of the bigger differences there. And then you've got Irish whiskey as well, Japanese whiskey, which is very much Scotch in its sense, just made in Japan. So there's a flavor I like to say for everybody, depending on what they're looking for. But there's even whiskeys now coming out of, places like India.
Yep,
that are actually made.
I drank whiskey in India. It tasted like Scotch.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone pretty much follows that Scotch profile more or less. Now the Irish people are going to send us all hate mail because they obviously started this whole crazy journey. But Irish whiskey has similar things, but for a lot of people, it's going to have a creamier mouthfeel. Obviously, you're not going to find a lot of peated Irish whiskeys, even though there are some out there. The flavor profile is going to be close. It's going to be a little bit different, but as I say, you have to do a lot of whiskey homework to figure it out. Which that's okay because that means drinking.
Well, I've been drinking more single grain Irish whiskeys recently simply because the cost of Scotch, the real Scotch from Scotland, has just gone up so much. And I find Irish whiskey, there's some Irish whiskeys that are fantastic. I mean, just really drinkable. When you think about bourbon versus rye, because you'll typically find bourbon and rye together in the American whiskey aisle. Essentially, think about my liquor store. You've got Scotch, and then there's an entire selection of Japanese whiskeys. Then there's an entire selection of Irish whiskeys. And before, you just have this little spot for American bourbons, and now it's literally an entire aisle, probably 100 feet of bottles, and rye and bourbon are standing together. And I guess from my standpoint, I struggle to tell the difference between rye and bourbon. And I know I don't drink I'm like you, I don't like old fashioned. I really don't like anything with sugar in it. And I discovered the same thing you discovered. If I'm putting any mixer in alcohol, I get a hangover, not a leftover. So I prefer water. It's just fine with my alcohol.
Sure.
Um, but I just struggle between those two taste profiles. Can you just maybe help me understand how I guess how they're treated differently? I mean, I've got some friends that go, rye's the best and no bourbon's the best. And then I'm gonna throw a zinger at you because I've also noticed that bourbon, Jefferson's got one, is also being aged in like port barrels and sherry barrels. So they're doing some different things with bourbon as well. And the Jefferson's in a port barrel is just outstanding. I mean, it's really one of the best. You have to just pour it in little pieces because you don't want to use it all up. But can you help me with rye and bourbon?
Sure, absolutely. And it's an interesting topic because a lot of people that I meet, especially when we go into these tastings, they're like, "Oh, don't put a rye in the tasting. I don't like rye." Rye, for some reason, is very polarizing, and we all like to joke that sometimes they just haven't tried the right rye, or some they gave you one that wasn't very good. But at the end of the day, they're very similar. Like I said, the only technical requirement difference is the ratio of grains, right? So 51% rye versus 51% corn or higher in either case. So if you have a Kentucky style rye, okay, which is going to have typically right at 51% rye and then a lot of corn and some malted barley in there for good measure. Um, if I put bourbon and a rye in front of you, you're absolutely right. You probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference because it takes a really good trained palate to notice that. But then if you take a rye like the one that's everywhere, bullet rye with the
Yeah.
green label, that's 95% rye, 5% malted barley. And that's going to present itself a lot different. So once again, if I put that in front of you and I put a bourbon in front of you and told you one was rye, one was bourbon, you would probably pick it out because you have a little experience drinking. Rye tends to be a little bit bolder, a little bit spicier as a general rule. Now, once again, there are no
Mhm.
absolutes in bourbon, and how you interpret taste and how I interpret taste are two completely different things, right? Different life experiences, different foods we've eaten growing up, different cultures we've lived in. Potentially, right? So, but rye is going to have, it could have black pepper in it. It could have those spicy notes in there. You can get mint, and a little bit of menthol as well in
Mhm.
it. And in some cases, you'll get dill, like a dill pickle. I did a single barrel
Interesting.
pick years ago of a rye, and it tasted like there was a dill pickle. And as odd as it sounds, it's absolutely delicious. We couldn't drink it fast enough. It was so good. So those are going to be a little bit more assertive flavors, and I think that is often what leads people to think that they don't like rye, especially if they're brand new. Because when you start drinking high proof spirits, there is a learning curve, right? If the first drink you have is 132 proof Booker's bourbon, you're probably never going to drink bourbon again. So you ease into it, and so I think as your palate develops, you're going to be able to handle and appreciate rye a little bit more. But the good news is, inside the world of rye, that has become more and more popular. It's not nearly at the level of bourbon popularity, but there are a large variety of ryes out there now, so you can explore. And rye, when we went into Prohibition, Irish whiskey was the most consumed whiskey, followed by rye, with bourbon in the back seat, right? And so, but rye didn't really come back after Prohibition for reasons that nobody can really explain. But that's some of the differences in the flavor profile. And as you said, there are so many out on the shelves someday, so right now, that it can be hard to figure it out. Add to that brands like you said, Jefferson's, right, who are what we call barrel finishing or cask
Mhm.
finishing,
Yeah.
where they take the whiskey after they've matured it, they then put it in a barrel that was used for holding port or sherry or rum or scotch or even tequila, right? Now this is taken from the playbook for Scotch, right?
Yep.
Scotch has been doing this for years, right? You talked about the Balvenie. Their Caribbean cask is a favorite of a
Mhm.
lot of people. Absolutely delicious. So that started happening to bourbon in the last 10 years as people were looking for ways not to only innovate, but also a lot of brands are what we call NDPs or non-distilling producers, meaning that they buy bourbon from someone else, probably someone that you heard of their master brand.
Yeah.
And in order to differentiate their product, they will finish it. And sometimes it's good bourbon finished well. Sometimes they're buying bourbon that the distillery didn't want, and they're trying to make it taste palatable by doing that. Jefferson started as a company that sourced all of their whiskey. Now they contract distill and they finish it. And so this is when I talk about this idea of drinking curious. The idea is to try different things, explore them, find out what you like, find out what you don't like, but understand what it is you like and don't like about them so that the next drink you're going to have is going to be better. So if you have a Jefferson's in port, and you're like, oh, I really dig this, but then you have one in sherry and you're like, oh, this is too sweet. Guess what? Try someone else's brand in sherry, and you may be able to determine that maybe you don't like sherry finishes,
Yep, that's
right?
true.
And once again, it's that homework that's a pleasure because you get to drink whiskey.
Yeah, that Jefferson Port's fantastic, but then it's not like I'm economical. I drink good alcohol, but there's a point where I'm like, okay, we've pushed that past being smart. It's just stupid. You mentioned the bullet rye. I like
Mhm.
bullet bourbon. It's not my favorite bourbon. It's a good middle of the road if you just you're having a party and you want a good bourbon. But the bullet rye is fantastic, and I buy it and I keep it on the shelf in my bar and I like it. Um, let's talk about bourbons real quickly, and because I don't know nearly as much as you do, and when I'm talking to people about bourbon, they blow me away with their knowledge. I drink Woodford. It's
Mhm.
what's on my bar. It's in my decanter. I drink it. I have a bourbon pretty much every night. It's my go-to. I can't go wrong with it. It just tastes good to me. It's easy. It's smooth. Um, what is it about Woodford? And I know a lot of people who drink it that makes it a whiskey that or a bourbon that people like. And then how do you branch off from a Woodford? And the way I look at Woodford is I think it's safe. Like it's like
Sure.
drinking Glenlivet and Scotch is a nice, safe Scotch. If you want someone to taste Scotch and not go, ugh, give them a Glenlivet, they'll probably be okay. Um,
Yeah.
and I kind of feel like Woodford's kind of like that. How do you branch off from a Scotch or from a bourbon like that and go try different things? And I'm not talking about, bottom shelf like an Evan Williams
Mhm.
or a Jack Daniels. I'm talking about just one up where you're really getting into craft bourbons. Um, how do you know like where you're going to find bourbons that are a step up from that you're going to like even better?
So Woodford is a common name that you hear for people, especially people who are recently in the bourbon, right? Been in it for a couple of
Mhm.
years. And when I started in bourbon, I drank a lot of it, right? And once again, it was safe. And I think, you know, um, palates change, right? So I think there's a natural advancement right now. If you had me a Woodford, I drink it. I would have no problem with it, but it's not a bottle I go out and purchase. It's just not my flavor profile that I
Mhm.
like right now. But it's the reason it's so on so many people's list as like that foundation bourbon, much like Jim Beam is for some people or Maker's Mark is for others, is because these are the brands that have been around a long time. When bourbon was 20 bottles on the shelf in the liquor store and Scotch was 300 bottles, right? The Woodford was one of those brands. It was artfully packaged. It had a good story around it. It was, backed by a really large company, Brown Forman, who also makes Jack Daniels, right? Woodford is their show pony, so to speak, in the bourbon world. So a lot of brand recognition comes along with that. And it kind of falls into that category of, well, this is what bourbon should taste like,
Yeah,
right?
I just find it to be, when I drink, like I keep an Evan Williams bottled and bond on my bar because people like to drink mixed drinks. If you want to put Coke in something, it's probably the best bourbon in the world for putting Coke in, maybe Jack. But
Mhm.
I don't really like bottled and bond to drink with water because it's too sharp. Like it's got
Okay.
this it's not like an aftertaste, it's just too sharp where I find Woodford to be smooth and I can put some in water, sit on the couch, watch a game, and I drink it slowly, and it's easy. It's just easy going down. And I would say Glenlivet is the same way in
Mhm.
Scotch. Although I did change I do reach out in Scotch and try different things in Scotch, but I've reached out in bourbon, and I found that some of the craft bourbons give me the same thing. It's so sharp that it's like it's almost a metallic at sharp versus like you
Gotcha.
talk about vanillas and some of the different things that you can taste. And I read your notes and I'm like, I'm trying to figure out how I taste those things. And, and that's where I do. I want to go. I love to buy some different bourbons. I keep going back to it's nice and smooth and easy.
Yeah, I mean, Woodford, even though it's not in my wheelhouse anymore, it does, think about it. It's a safe proof level, right? So
Mhm.
it's not super high proof. It's got a lot of flavor going on it. It's rich, it's consistent, and a lot of this comes from how they blend it as well, right? So they
Mhm.
blend really good barrels, and at the end of the day, Brown Forman, they make fantastic whiskey, right? How they prep it and blend it and flavor profile, they create something for everyone, right? So I like Woodford. It's not something to go for now, but that's okay, right? So I think these brands that have been around for a while, the one whether we could just as easily be having this conversation and swap Woodford for Maker's Mark because I've had this
Mhm.
conversation a lot. So people have their first one; it's what they think bourbon should taste
Mhm.
like. So then as they branch out and they try different things, right? You've got to overcome it's going to taste different potentially.
Mhm.
It could be not artfully as blended together or crafted. It could be a different mash bill recipe. Woodford Reserve is what we call a high rye mash bill
Mhm.
bourbon. So it has 18 plus percent or more of rye in it, which gives it a little bit more backbone, as I like to call it, a little more
Mhm.
complexity to it. Maker's Mark is a wheated bourbon, whereas wheat instead of rye, it's a
Mhm.
little bit softer on the palate, a little less exciting, at the
Mhm.
standard bottling. But when it comes to the question of expanding your palate, the tastings that um, we do all these tastings blind, meaning that when someone gets a kit like the one that you received, they're labeled one, two, three, four. We remove the label prejudice because we know people have their favorites like you do with Woodford, right? So what we do is introduce them to trying these things without any sort of baggage associated with it and only let their palate decide. Because an interesting thing has happened. I've done plenty of tastings where the favorite, in this case, Woodford would be in the lineup, and it could come out last
Mhm.
on your palate for a lot of reasons. So, what I encourage people to do is to explore with friends, have people get together, blind it, put a bag over the bottle. It sounds weird, sounds looks like a hobo, but it allows you to try new things and kind of explore from there. But we also teach people to understand what goes into the recipes. Every
Mhm.
bourbon, most of you can find out what the recipes are. And that becomes a thing to say, okay, I like high rye. So what's another high rye bourbon out in the market that I can try that's a
And
similar
maybe
proof?
that's why I like the Bullet Rye better than I like the Bullet Bourbon. It could very well
Yeah.
be. What
Yeah, exactly.
what are you drinking now in bourbon? And I'm gonna ask you to give it to us in a couple of slices. What do you like that's super affordable? What do you like that is sort of mid tier? You're going to spend, you know, $35 to $50 a bottle. And
Mhm.
what are you loving that is a not for the weak of wallet?
Great. Um, at least I'm glad you didn't ask me what my favorite bourbon was. That's the one that's always tricky. So if I'm going to drink inexpensively, when I travel, a lot of times I'll go to a hotel bar, and I'm fortunate I have a lot of bottles at home, so I don't need to try exotic things when I'm out. I'll go to a bar and I'll drink Wild Turkey 101.
Okay.
I call it the best utility bottle you can have at home, and quite literally, you can drink it neat. You can put it on ice. You can let your neighbor put it in their Diet Coke, and in a pinch, you can degrease your engine if you really need to. And at $19 a bottle, it punches way above its weight.
I mean, I'm glad to hear you
Um,
say that because I've got a gallon of it under my bar that I had for a party that I bought, and
yeah,
I look at Wild Turkey and think, yeah, I don't drink Wild Turkey, but I'm gonna crack that thing open and give it a shot.
people. I like to joke that people think that that only old men, bikers, and badasses drink Wild Turkey. It's up to you to figure out which one you are. Jumping up in price range, probably one of my favorite bourbons that's come onto the market in the last couple of years is a brand called Green River out of
Okay.
Owensboro, Kentucky. The distillery has a long, long history, even being known as the most expensive bourbon ever purchased because a gentleman traded his shares in a gold mine for a whole bunch of barrels, and the gold mine paid out. But it's a bourbon that came in the market. It's not super complex. It's not a bourbon that's going to win all these high. It's not going to compete in the awards with the Pappy Van Winkles of the world. But you know what? It is a delicious whiskey. It's a moderate proof in the low 90s. But best of all, it's 34.99 a bottle. And it's what we call a sessionable bourbon, which sounds a little bit weird if you know what session beers are, right? But a sessionable bourbon is a bourbon you can sit down with a couple buddies, right? And drink over the course of an evening. and you're not going to blow out your taste buds. You're not going to blow out your voice. And, as long as it's just not two buddies versus four or five,
Yeah.
you can drink the whole bottle and the next morning you're going to be okay. And they've done a fantastic job of bringing reasonably priced, well-made bourbon to the market. And they now have a high rye bourbon, a wheated bourbon. They've got a rye whiskey. They've got some full proof, some single barrels. All of them were very well priced. So that's what I put into that category. We start getting up to the closer to the $100 range. There is a lot of bourbon, as you indicated, when you go into the liquor store. And unfortunately, a lot of the brands that have come into the market, a lot of this has been sourced, a lot of finishing gimmicks and things of that done with it, and it's all terribly overpriced. And at Drink Curious, and my personal philosophy is, you don't need to spend a lot of money to drink well. You don't need an old bourbon to drink well. Say older isn't better, expensive isn't better. So if I'm right around that $100 price point, one of the best drinkers you're going to get is some Four Roses cask strength single barrels.
Yep.
So these are private barrel selections that a store, a restaurant, our bourbon club have gone out. They go down to Four Roses. We're doing it in December, and you taste 10 recipes. You don't know what they are. You pick the best one and you bottle it up. It's going to be usually in the high teens, the low 30s in terms of proof, 7 to 10 years old, and it is absolutely delicious. And there's a lot of variety because they make 10 different recipes. And for $105, absolutely a desert island
Yep.
bourbon in my book.
Yep. It's funny you said that because if you think about Four Roses, it's got to be some incredible story there because it was rock gut, bottom of the barrel. Like Four Roses bourbon was what you drank when you were down on your down and out. But they came out with the single barrel. And what you're talking about is a step up from that, but that's a good bourbon.
Yes, absolutely. Four Roses was the number one selling bourbon in this country going into the 50s. And it was good. It wasn't the rocket you're referring to. And what happened was Four Roses was purchased by Seagram's. And the owner of Seagram's thought the future of American whiskey was blended light whiskey. So in order to make that happen, he removed Four Roses from the bourbon from the US market and replaced it with a blended whiskey, a light whiskey, which then became the reputation of the Rotgut. They still made bourbon and shipped it overseas, Japan being one of those places. And so imagine, your number one product, you buy a company, the number one product, you get rid of it because you think you have a better idea. Well, that didn't really work out, thankfully. But Four Roses didn't get back into the market. I think it was 2001, 2002. They're now owned by a Japanese company. So is, Beam Suntory. It's not Jim Beam anymore, it's Beam Suntory. And the Japanese people are fantastic stewards of whiskey. So it's come back to the market. So call that a cautionary tale, if you will.
Yeah.
And how a beloved brand can lose its shine, but with enough passionate people, it can come back. And it's sort of raising the seas for all types of bourbons. A lot of brands coming back. It's raising the tide for Irish whiskey. At the end of Prohibition, there were hundreds of Irish distilleries making products. By the end of the 20th century, there were only 3 distilleries left. Now there's 30 plus either built or are in process of being built. So we're kind of in that second golden age, if you will, of not only bourbon, but whiskey in general.
It's funny you talk about the Japanese as good stewards of whiskey because they have uh, just done some incredible things. But I was outside of Aberdeen on a tour, really back of the house tour of a distillery there that's not well known. You can't find it here in the U.S. It's owned by Suntory. There was only 2 people on the tour. It was me and an executive from Suntory, and the meticulousness and the care and the intention that executive put into every one of our tastings, and we were tasting directly out of the barrels in some cases. It was outstanding. I mean, I was in awe because you're going through and you're drinking a little bit. He just took his time, and it made me take my time, and it was out of love. Like he enjoyed it so much that it made me enjoy it so much, and that's when I fell in love with Suntory. And in my head, they're not just another big brand; they really are good stewards of creating a great whiskey.
There's a lot of intentionality around what the Japanese do. I happen to have my college degree is in Japanese studies, and I've lived there for multiple times. Unfortunately, it was before I liked whiskey. I really kind of disliked it when I went there because, as you know, I was 18 and then 20. So if I could go back in time, and that's kind of like when people are like, "What's your dream goal with what you're doing?" And my dream goal is to get a brand to or company to bring me to Japan to talk bourbon, right, and kind of walk the back alleys because a lot of those Japanese bartenders were keeping bourbon alive because they were coming to the U.S. and they were buying things and doing that. But the Japanese, the way they approach business, whiskey, things of that nature, is really fascinating because they took the best of Scotch, right, and
Mhm.
brought it over and took it and made it Japanese in many cases. And you're absolutely right; it gets you pause. In fact, one of my favorite little places to hang out when I used to go to New York was down in the East Village. There was a place called Village Yokocho, which was a izakaya style restaurant, and you walk up this pair of stairs, you're not sure what you're walking into, it's noisy, whatnot. And you have a nice, informal, street dinner there. But then in the corner of this establishment is this little door, and you walk over. And when you open the door, you walk into a little Japanese speakeasy bar called the Angel's Share. They only let you in groups of four, and it can only hold like 20 people. And that's the type of experience. It's like being in Japan. You sit in, it's small. Each ice cube is hand carved, right? It takes 15 minutes just to do a pour of whiskey on the rocks because of it. But you take it in, you watch it, you take in the sensories. And that's what's really cool about bourbon is because it can make you slow down, it can make you reconnect, become sort of that foundation, if you will. And that's ultimately, how for me, writing about bourbon and experiencing it with Bourbon and Banter, and then as we took it in the Drink Curious was this is this opportunity that checks a lot of boxes what people are trying to accomplish as they're reaching out to strangers, right? And build that relationship. And so I think, whether it's Japanese whiskey or American bourbon, whatever it is, it's all kind of fundamentally built into that. And the more time you spend on it, the better the results are going to be.
Love it. Okay, so we've got this handy dandy box that you sent me, and
Yeah.
this is what I've been waiting for. But um, this is what you do with your folks, and I also want to show people. Pop sent me this brochure that's beautifully done, and I'm recently wrote the AI Edge over here, and but he built this entire thing with AI. It's absolutely gorgeous. It looks like you hired a high-end marketing firm to build this for you. So a little Chat GPT, a little is Fallow, right? Because I think we use that too.
Fathom,
Fathom, right? Fathom, we use that
right?
too. My sales team uses that, and then some Canva. So absolutely, just I mean this is truly when I got this thing, I was like, this is really good marketing. Love it.
Well, and like I said, just to give a shout out to, I got the idea from one of your podcasts, right? You had a woman on, they were talking about AI and you're like, "Hey, I got this idea and I don't think anybody will do it." And the challenge was I went into to Zoom, right? And I just recorded myself like I
Mhm.
was doing a sales call. And I talked all the permutations of sales calls. So it was a little long. I had it transcribed, put in the Chat GPT, worked out prompts. I told her I wanted to build an ebook. I wanted to have 7 chapters because that's what people like. I said, come up with some headings based on what I talk about. Then I took each heading, drilled down into a little bit, cleaned it up, and then took a template in Canva, changed the colors to match the brand. And it's been a great piece for me because as I market to people, right, I have a lot of automations built into my sales process because I'm a team of one from that perspective. And I send this piece. And even though they've had calls with me or conversations, I send this to them and I always say, "Hey, I read that thing. And you know what? Something clicked. I always thought of you as this, but you threw this out there, and that's another way I can apply it." And that's the marketing background that I bring is the fact of like at the end of the day, I do spirits tastings, bourbon, Irish whiskey, whatever. But how we leverage that and how we position that is endless. And that's really what makes it fun. I love talking to people, educating, but when I can solve a problem, absolutely, it's fantastic.
Yeah, I'm so sorry that you're on camera and I'm on camera because I'd love to be sitting in a bar with you having this
Oh,
conversation.
well, we'd probably never stop. It'd be like a 6-hour podcast.
I know the brochure is beautiful, and what a great lesson. You record it, then you get it into your AI and you hone it, and then you use a tool like Canva, which my team is power user in Canva, and you put it all together, and there you go. You've got this incredible brochure that gets people to think differently about you and your brand. So when someone signs up with you to do a virtual
Mhm.
tasting, they get a box like this in the mail. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah. So a client will engage with us. We'll figure out, do a briefing exercise. What spirits do we want to use? What's the meeting? Obviously, the first question is it going to be virtual or in
Yeah.
person? Because we do in person as well. But then ultimately, once we start the process, yes, each individual who is going to attend is going to get a kit shipped to them. So we've worked with some partners who are able to fulfill these farthest, get these out, and we put these kits together that everyone gets. It can be sent to their home, to be sent to their workplace. Has everything that they need for tasting. The only thing that they can provide themselves if they want it is water, right? Everything else is in there, and because if somebody has to go track down glasses and stuff like that, everything falls apart. So once again, I found out early I'm actually, Jeb, I think more in the logistics business than the whiskey business. But yeah, so we send these kits out. And if you want to go ahead and open up,
Okay.
I'll kind of talk you through.
Okay, so everybody can see
What,
here because
yeah,
is this on camera? Okay, good. So I'm opening the top here. Okay, so right on
right?
top, I've got a couple of stickers here,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then
Everybody loves stickers.
yeah,
So
I
we do
love a
little stickers.
sticker, and then I've
We have a
got
welcome card.
got a welcome card and a bourbon flywheel, and then
Yeah. So,
are you ready? And tasting notes.
yeah. Yeah. So the welcome card we customize with the logo of the client, a short message,
Okay.
point of contact. The reverse of that is a tasting mat where people are going to put their cups. In that box, there's also should be a box that has, in this case, 4 plastic cups in there that people are going to use for the tastings.
Okay.
A lot of our clients, though, will actually upgrade and we'll do whiskey
Okay.
glasses
I've
like
got
this one I
cups.
have in my hand here.
Oh,
Yeah,
I think I have one of those too. I have
yeah, I think I put one in your kit. Yeah,
a
so
beautiful whiskey glass here.
yeah, a Glencairn
Oh,
whiskey glass. Some clients
you
even
already have
send.
yours loaded.
That's right. Well, I'm the professional here. I have to come prepared. Some of our clients even send 4 glasses. It's
Yeah.
which makes a really nice kit.
Now tell me about this particular glass because you see this glass like the tour I was on in Scotland with the executive from
Mhm.
Suntory. We had glasses like this that we were doing our tastings from.
Yeah, so that is known as a Glencairn
Okay.
whiskey glass. The official glass of whiskey, as they tag it. This was created by Glencairn. And the idea is that by creating this shape, right? If you think about a wine glass, right? A wine glass is kind of narrow in to concentrate the aromas. This has got a similar format. You've got this wide bulb at the bottom to put the
Mm.
whiskey in. And then as the liquors come up, it's going to concentrate. So as you nose it, okay, you're able to take that in. Now, once again, I would start my tastings with this is not a wine tasting.
Yeah.
And so when we get to the spirit part, Jeb, remember, keep your nose above the glass.
And I'm
Okay.
not. I just want to be clear. I'm not spitting it out after I put it in my mouth. I'm
No,
drinking
no,
it.
absolutely. Right. So you don't want to put your nose down in the glass
Ulysses,
unless
you've
you're
got a
a real
bucket over
pro.
here for me because I got to drive home. But I got my wife here. She's going to take me.
There you go. So, and then we have 4 samples in there.
Okay.
Right. And in this case,
Okay.
these are 1-ounce samples labeled 1, 2, 3, 4. Once
Okay,
again,
there's
we
number
remove the
4
label prejudice.
and
To,
number 1
Mhm.
and number 2. All right, and number 3. Okay.
Right.
I think I got everything out of here. Is that right? I do. Okay.
That's right.
So I'm going to move this to the
And
side. So I have
perfect.
my Glencairn glass and 1, 2, 3, 4. I have got my Cells gravy water and I have let's get the table up just a little bit. All right, here we go. How's that? Okay. So I got my Cells gravy water and I do have a little cup of ice over here just in case because I do like
Right.
a little ice. Okay. All right.
Okay.
What's next?
So go ahead and take that tasting mat, put that in front of you with the 1, 2, 3, 4 circles on it.
Okay. Ulysses, I'm gonna need a
And then
pen. Yep. All right. I'm getting a pen. All right. Here we go.
all right, and then go ahead and open that box up and put your cups out on the 1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay. All right. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay.
Okay. And then typically what people do, they'll go ahead and open the samples and they'll pour some into the cup. Once again, you don't have to drink all that. You could save some for later
Okay.
if you like.
All right. I got a little one there.
Okay. All right. So typically they'll do that. And while they're pouring those samples out, we'll talk about the flavor wheel,
Okay.
which you commented on. And
Okay.
this
Here's the
is,
flavor wheel, folks.
yeah, so this is called a bourbon flavor wheel. You may have seen them for wine tastings or food tastings. cigars have them. And this is one for bourbon that gives you the most common aromas and flavors that you're going to experience in bourbon. And I say the word common because taste is personal, is subjective, right? A lot of people get marzipan out of bourbon, but if you've never had marzipan, guess what? You're not going to smell or taste,
Marzipan.
right? Right. You might say, hey, this just smells like crushed up sweet almonds, right? And guess what? Voila, marzipan. So we talk about the flavor wheel a little bit to kind of teach people how to use that as we go. But we also keep this very unstressful in that it's there as a reference. If you want to use it, great. We're not going to talk about it professionally during the tasting, but it's there for you to kind of say, hey, I'm smelling something that smells familiar, but I can't put my finger on it, because we actually have a physiological challenge as humans that we often can't describe in words what we are tasting or smelling. So this is kind of a reference card to help you with that
Okay.
effort.
All right.
All right. So once that's done, we typically start off with a little bit of uh, pro tips, if you will, for
Okay.
tasting. And that, but go ahead and take sample number one, Jeb,
Okay.
and pour it into the nice glass right now,
Okay.
into your Glencairn.
And just for everybody, I put just a drop of water in there.
Right. It's a very common thing coming from the Scotch world, and just so people understand why, by dropping a little bit of water, it can open up the aromas and the flavors on a whiskey. When we do a tasting, typically we start neat and then have people add in, so everybody's tasting the same. I do it with Scotch a lot. With bourbon, I don't add water. I think it has the opposite effect. But once again, this is where
I
the
just
personal.
violated all the rules, but I don't drink
That's all
bourbon
right.
right anyway. So
That's right. That's right. There is no right way to drink bourbon. Just remember that. So once again, as you're smelling it, keep your nose right at the tip of the glass, and then open your mouth when you do it, and breathe in through both at the same time.
I never did that before. Okay, that makes
Yeah,
wow.
that's called retronasal. That's not only going to protect you from getting all the alcohol at once, it also allows you to smell more, because really, um, s- 75 to 80% of tasting is coming from that smell. So by bringing it up through both
Mm.
aspects of your breathing, you're going to get a wider array of aromas and flavors. So we also pause and look at the color, right? With the whiskeys.
Mhm.
If you look at that one versus sample number
Yep.
4, you'll see sample number 4 is very dark,
Yes.
right? And whiskey, 100% of the color comes from the time in the barrel. So
Mm.
color can help you make some
Mm.
potential deductions, right? Like the darker whiskey, 80, 85 plus percent of the time, typically will mean it's older.
Okay.
Other times it could mean it's higher proof because it hasn't been diluted, but it gives you some ideas. But we look at the whiskey, and we'll also roll the whiskey around in the
Okay.
glass, and you'll see little streaks. In the bourbon
Mhm.
world, we refer to those as legs.
Okay.
And when you see nice, thick, viscous, oily legs, it gives you a sense of what the mouthfeel is going to be like, the
Okay.
flavor profile. And then it's ultimately, we're going to smell it. And in the tasting, we talk about what do we smell, right? And I never tell people what I'm smelling until they've all chimed in. Because if I tell you I smell peaches, you're going to smell peaches. It's the power of suggestion. And this is where a lot of the engagement happens
Mhm.
when we're doing these tastings, right? Because we ask everyone to be on camera. We get pretty strong numbers on people actually showing up and chime in verbally, chime
Mhm.
in the chat. We get people going. Our clients will call people out as well. And this just really gets people engaged and have a little bit of fun with it, because it's not a judgment zone, right? If you smell something and I don't
Mhm.
smell it, that's fine. It's there for you. So what do you get anything jump
Yeah,
out on the nose for you, Jeb?
I smell it. I've got a cross between vanilla and butterscotch.
Okay, excellent. All right, excellent. And then for me, I get vanilla and caramel in there,
Mhm.
and I get what I call a floral nose,
Mhm.
which is kind of like, I describe it as you walk into a room and there's a
Mhm.
flowers in the room, but you don't know what kind. It just smells flowery. And so floral would be the term for that up front. And because we don't buy whiskey just to smell it, let's go ahead
Mhm.
and give it a sip. I tell people, small sip, let it just hit the tip of your tongue. That's where your sweet receptors are, kind of let your mouth acclimate. When you're ready, take a second sip and gently roll it around the entirety of your mouth, and think about not just the flavors, but where are the flavors popping? Tip your tongue, sweeter notes, mid palates, more savory, and the back and the sides of your tongue tend to pick up more of those peppery, spicy notes.
Yep.
And you get any flavors specifically jumping out on the palate?
I get back to vanilla, caramel, and butterscotch. And in fact, when I and it definitely spicy on the back of the palate.
Okay.
Kind of like almost a Bordeaux wine
Oh,
spicy.
okay.
But
Excellent. Okay.
I think the caramel comes. I was going to tell you vanilla and caramel, but I'm trying to put it together. It smells like butterscotch, um, but it, but definitely, it's got a good start.
Yeah,
A
absolutely.
little
And
harder on the back of the palate.
what's interesting is if you drank through all four of these, right, and
Mhm.
came back to number one, it may have a different finish on that back
Mhm.
palate because it's the first drink,
Yep.
theoretically, right? And so the nice thing about with whiskeys, and I think this is what's really fun, is I could drink a whiskey today, a bourbon today, and then 3 days from now, I could drink it a little bit later in the evening after dinner, and I will get a different sensory experience from it. So when we receive samples to review, we have to try a whiskey no less than 3 times just to make sure we're getting consistency in our thoughts about it. Um, and that's why you can even change the order of these whiskeys and create people's vote for their favorite will be different, like the
Yeah.
Pepsi challenge, if you will. So we go through we go, so what will happen in one of these tastings? We would have done a little bit of education up front, like the Bourbon 101 that we did. We would have started tasting this, and then we'll give everybody a chance to guess what it is. And this is where we inject a little bit of gamification into the meeting, right? So if people can guess, a lot of my clients will then give a gift certificate to them to buy a bottle,
Okay.
right?
Oh,
Or they may offer, hey, follow through with a book a meeting or a demo with us one-on-one. We'll send you a bottle of your favorite from the tasting. So there's a lot of gamification
I
about
like
that.
that.
But then what we do is we unveil it, and we'll tell people what the bourbon is. In this case, this first one that you're trying right now, this is Wyoming Whiskey Small Batch Bourbon. It's 88 proof, and we have slides that go on the screen and everything that show this stuff. But it's actually a wheated bourbon, meaning
Mhm.
it's made with wheat instead of rye. So it's bourbon, wheat, and then malted barley. Much like Maker's Mark, Larceny, Weller, and the
Mhm.
infamous Pappy Van Winkle are all wheated bourbon. So it's got more vanilla and caramel in it. It's a little bit softer on the palate as a gentle rule. It's 5 years old and it's made in Kirby, Wyoming.
And I have a
So
bottle of this,
just
by
not a
the way,
name.
on my bar that someone gave me as a gift that I haven't
You
opened.
really?
Yep, I sure do.
Oh, fantastic. So I'll give you a little trivia that you can tell your friends when they come over. This is 88 proof, meaning it's 44% ABV. Any guesses why they picked that proof?
No.
It's because Wyoming was the 44th state in the
Oh,
union.
how about that?
So you can win some bar bets with that
I
one.
like that. Very good. And when I say bar, but folks, I got to actually have a really big bar. So it's got lots of room. So if you want to send me a bottle of bourbon, just hit me up and I'll give you my address.
There you go. So and then we rinse and repeat this process with a
Okay.
little bit of different education for each one as we go through. So the
Okay.
next thing we would talk about are the different grains used and how that affects flavor and how to use that knowledge to identify the type of bourbon that you like best, which becomes very helpful for people, much as we were
Mm.
talking about. Why do I like Woodford so much? Right.
Yeah. This is
So
softer.
number two,
Yeah. Number two is
softer,
softer.
a little bit darker in color.
More brown sugar,
Okay. Okay. You get more oak on the nose.
more oak and more caramel.
Okay.
Not
And so
the vanilla's gone.
it's like being CSI, right? So you're like, it's a little darker, so it
A-
probably should be older, and you nose it, it's a little oakier.
And chocolate, cocoa, a soft
Oh, okay.
chocolate.
Okay. Interesting. Okay.
So it's like drinking wine. You're right, because you get into a flight of wine, by the last one you're smelling, you got blackberries and currant. I've
Right.
never had a currant in my life, but that's what I'm tasting.
But you can pick them out in a wine,
That's
right?
right, rhubarb.
That's right. And what's really fun is, you can go into a tasting and you can blindfold people, and you can actually, when you're in person, and you can put fruits in front of them. And it's amazing how often people can't pick out
Mhm.
a fruit by smell until they see it.
You know what's
Like you think you know what a
Yep.
banana smells like?
Yeah. You know what's interesting about this one right here in particular? It actually
Mhm.
has a little bit of a Scotch profile, believe it or not.
Interesting.
It's,
Okay.
just on when you put it on your tongue and roll it around. Um,
And
yeah,
see,
there's
what's
something about
interesting
the
about
way that
that
it
is
sits in the middle of your tongue. It's got a Scotch profile. I'm not saying it tastes like Scotch, but it's got the same,
right.
texture.
And that's, this is one of the cool things about this is you've drank a lot of scotch,
Mhm.
right? So someone who hasn't can't bring that to the conversation,
Yep.
right? And this is what often happens when we're together with groups of people doing these. Somebody will do something like that, and then they drop a little knowledge to that person. Then the next thing you see those guys talking a little bit later, sidebarring. A lot of fun. This one is 90 proof. This is what we call a traditional mash bill bourbon. So this is going to be, old school bourbon flavor, kind of like the
Mhm.
standard. This is Russell's Reserve 10-year-old bourbon.
Really?
This is a wild turkey product.
Why
Um,
you like the wild
and it's
turkey?
and it's a 10-year-old bourbon, and you can still get this for about $35. And most, if you look at most things out in the market today, um, a lot of brands are charging you upwards of $10 per
Yeah,
year of age. So to be able to get this for 35 bucks, it's a steal.
no doubt. That is a steal. Russell's Reserve, 10-year.
10-year.
Perfect. So
Absolutely.
Wyoming and then Russell's Reserve. It's so crazy. I've got a bottle of Wyoming. I've never cracked it open. I had some folks who came by and I kept their horses on my farm for a little while and they gave me a bottle of that to say thank you.
Yeah, it's been a fan. For that Wyoming, I don't know if you picked up on it, but I get a lot of candied orange, like those orange slices you can
Mhm.
buy at the store in the bags. Those candied Brock's orange slices. I get a lot of that in there, but I've got a very sensitive palate for citrus.
Interesting. I don't get orange at all. Um, and the I get this on the nose. I get cocoa and um, brown sugar, but the
Mhm.
but the taste I get oak. It's really oaky.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The orange I got was on the Wyoming. This one for
Oh,
me, there is a little bit there, but it's a lot of maple, vanilla, darker
mhm.
flavors, a lot of oak. I also get some leather and tobacco on
Mm.
the palate with this one. I love cigars, so this is a fantastic style to pair with a
Man,
cigar.
you can come hang out
Very
with me. You know
rustic.
what I found the other day, Go? I swear to you, I found we were moving a big piece of furniture, and I had stuffed 25 years ago a box of Cubans that were still wrapped, completely wrapped, in the back of there. They've been sitting there for 20. I forgot all about them, so I
Holy
moved
cow!
them into my wine cellar, and they've been sitting there now for about 8 months. And
I
so
hope you can resurrect it, man. That'd
yeah,
be nice.
yeah, it was a box of, I believe they're a box of Monte Cristos. Um,
Holy cow!
yeah, I think 25 years. I don't know how age works with cigars, but they certainly were in a dark, cool place and with good humidity. So I think they're probably going to be in good shape. So now they're sitting in
Wow,
56 degrees in my wine cellar for a while.
nice, nice work. Yeah, I love pairing cigars with bourbons, things of that nature. It's my mental health check, if you will. That's how I end my days, right?
Ah,
Cigar, a little bourbon.
that's right. I love that.
Um, all right, did you get number? You're on number
Okay,
three
I'm on
now.
number three now.
All right.
Hmm, that's hard.
So, anything different on the nose compared to the first two? And one of the fun
It's even
things
softer. I would say
you can
more
go
fruity,
back
more fruity, more floral.
more fruity.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Good. And one of the fun things you can even go back to those cups which are
Mhm.
empty now, and you can smell them and compare and contrast. This isn't something you want to do in a bar because they'll
Yeah.
probably call an Uber and send you home.
That's vanilla.
Just sniffing empty glasses.
That's that's brown sugar. This is
Mhm.
tropical.
Okay. I get oak, citrus again, vanilla, more spice. I get a lot
Yeah,
more spice in
it's
there.
spice. I get spice in here. I get
And I get dark fruit. I get darker fruits. So things like figs,
mm,
raisins,
I'm
I get a little bit
getting
added in
I'm
there.
getting tropical. I know this is crazy, but I get tropical and that anise, savory,
Oh, okay.
spicy.
All right. Good.
Oh, I like that.
Like that?
Yeah, that's now the taste is a leathery, um,
Okay.
smooth, silky. Wow. Wow, that is outstanding.
So
That's my kind of
that
that's my kind of liquor right there.
all right. So that is 84.8 proof. So we've dropped
Mhm.
quite a bit in proof. What you're drinking is Michter's US1 rye whiskey.
Michter's. How you spell Michter's?
Micht, T as in Tom, ER''S.
And
Michter's.
Michter's Rye?
Yes, US1 rye.
US1 Rye. Wow.
It is a single barrel, but you can buy it in the store.
Mhm.
So once again, it may vary a little bit. No age statement, but we know it's typically somewhere between 6 and 8 years old. And they don't give us the recipe, the mash bill. So, but we know by law it has to be at least 51% rye. I would probably put it not
Mhm.
much higher than 60%. It's more of a Kentucky style rye.
Maybe I'm a rye
Um,
guy. Maybe that's I mean, you're starting to
that's
you're
the
starting to
thing,
convince me that because the Woodford has got such a big rye content, and
right?
the Bullet rye I like so much better than the Bullet bourbon, and this just knocked me off my feet. This is really good.
No, and Michter's is really cool because the brand heritage goes all the way back. I mean, George Washington visited the Michter's distillery, right? To give you some timing,
Mm.
used to be in Pennsylvania. It's all in Kentucky now. One of the cool things that they do, Deb, is when they put the whiskey in the barrel, most distilleries will put them into the barrel at that limit, 125 proof. Michter's goes in down at 103 proof, which means they put more water in. And water is what pulls flavor out of barrels. So you get arguably a different, more enjoyable flavor profile. It's more expensive because you use more barrels, right? I think we did the rough math with if Maker's Mark lowered their entry
Mhm.
proof by just 5%, they would spend over $1 million more a month just in extra barrels, if not more. So it's not a cheap process, but it creates a more flavorful and I think a better mouthfeel
Mhm.
on the whiskey
Oh,
as well. So I'm glad you like that
this
one.
is good. This is exactly why I drink French wine, because I like the finish on this, and
Okay.
I much prefer the finish on a good French wine than I do, or a good Bordeaux than I do California wines. Nobody send me at nasty notes. I drink California wines, but I
Well, you
like
got
the
the
I
Californians and
like
the Irish
yeah,
after us.
I like the I love the finish on this. This is really good.
And so if you were drinking that, what would you expect that the cost?
60 to $80.
Okay. So I'm in St. Louis, so price adjust, about 45.
About 45. Wow.
Yeah.
Cool.
So once again, in a sea of madness of ever increasing prices, a fantastic purchase. Now, they do offer some 10-year-old versions, which
Mhm.
are close to $200, which are fantastic. But this bottle, when I put it in blind tastings, once again, all those people that say they don't like rye, they get to this and they're like, wow, this is really good.
And the
So
age, the longer it's the age for the barrel is it evens it out with it darkens it up, makes it more is it just makes it more like I said it was like there's a texture to it's like leather in your mouth. It just is it
S so the mouthfeel comes from a lot of places. When you think about the barrel, I think about a barrel like a rechargeable battery. When it's brand new, it has a 100% charge of color and flavor to impart. So what actually happens is when you make a barrel, these brand new char ones, when we char it, we're creating a layer of charcoal. And charcoal does what charcoal does best. It filters. So a little bit of science here, but it's a 53-gallon barrel typically. When that liquid gets hot, like in a Kentucky summer, the liquid expands, pushes into the barrel. When it gets cold, it contracts. So as it pushes into that charcoal, it's cleaning it up. It's removing sulfur and other elements from the whiskey that can create off aromas and off flavors. Behind that charcoal layer is what's called the red line, which is a caramelized layers of sugars that's broken down hemicellulose. Has been broken down to where we get the caramel, the color, the smokiness. Beyond that, the bare wood is also broken down. Lignin has been changed into vanillin, and from vanillin, right, we get vanilla. But we also get oak, we get tannins and bitterness as well. So every time you push in, you're getting that. Every time you extract, you're reversing and getting that same process. So that's your color, your flavor. And by the time we send those overseas to Scotland, 30, 40% charge maybe left in those barrels, which is what they like. They want a more grain forward
Mhm.
spirit. We want a more barrel forward spirit, typically with
Gotcha.
bourbon.
Oh, that makes a
So
lot of
that's
sense. I've never heard
that's
anybody
that's
put it
what's
that
creating
way.
that. Yeah. And that's what happens. And then you take those barrels and put them in a rick house
Mhm.
in Kentucky, which is made to accelerate to basically amplify the hot and the cold, and you get some magic going on in those warehouses.
What how far are they pushing aging out now with
Mm.
with bourbon? I had a 125-year-old Scotch that I had the privilege to taste, which was outstanding. But that's a long time for a Scotch to be in the barrel, and it
Yes,
was
it
so
is.
expensive because of what the Angel shared, the evaporation.
Right.
Where are they pushing to it in? I mean, I see 10 years, but you don't really see much beyond that.
So you're seeing it a little bit more and more. Like I said, old bourbon didn't exist until the
Mm.
70s, really, because uh, once bourbon starts getting past 10, 12 years old, um, if you're not careful, it can become overaged, over oaked is what they call
Okay.
it. So 1 month it tastes great. You go 3 months later, check on it, and you're like, oh crap, it's too woody, it's too oaky, and you either have to throw it into a big batch blend or you sell it off. But there are brands out there. Pappy Van Winkle has a 23-year-old, right? It's too oaky for my palate. I've tasted export bottles that were sent to Japan in the 80s that were 28 years old. Absolutely don't like it. And I had, much like you, I had the privilege of trying one of the oldest bourbons ever. And I think it was 42 years old when I tried it. The worst whiskey, worst spirit I've ever put into my mouth. It was, I tell people, if you've ever been on a canoe trip, a float trip, right down a river, and you see a tree that's half in the water, half above it, imagine you dove into the water, were able to scoop some of that wood up and keep it intact in your hand and then throw it in your mouth. Imagine what that would taste like. And then after you swallow it, your mouth is invaded by the Sahara Desert and all the moisture
Ah,
sucked out of your mouth, like the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's absolutely wretched. So for me, when bourbons get above 12 years old, I have to be really careful. I won't buy a bottle over 12 years old traditionally unless I can try it because I'm sensitive to oak. Some people love it. But you're never going to get that because 1 year I think Beam Suntory did some sort of test. And so these aren't hard, fast rules, but it's good for example. But you think about 1 year in Kentucky, roughly 3 years in Scotland to get the same effect,
gotcha.
right? So a 30-year-old Scotch is roughly equivalent, once again, to 10-year-old bourbon, just as a placeholder, right?
Is
There's not a direct comparison.
is that a case for the layering of barrels? So you age a bourbon for 5 or 6 years in an oak barrel, and then you pull it out and you put it in a port barrel or a rum barrel, which what they've been doing for Scotch for a long time. And I agree with you. The 14-year-old Balvenie that's in the rum cask is
Mhm.
wow. It's just amazing. I can't afford it anymore. I used to could afford it, but I
Right,
can't afford it anymore because it's well over $100. But does
right.
that open the door for more experimentation with different barrels as you
Yeah, I
go on,
mean,
like to avoid that pure oaky flavor?
it doesn't necessarily avoid the oaky because sometimes when you finish it, because it's finished to create an alternative flavor profile.
Mhm.
And if you finish in something like French oak, you can get a lot more tannin extraction. So it tastes woody, even though it's not necessarily that old, like 6 months in French oak. And sometimes I don't want to drink the bourbon because it's too oaky. What they've done in Scotland is they obviously start with the used barrel first of all, right? So they have a lot less flavor, but they will move. So they may put it in a sherry barrel for a period of time. They may put it then back in a bourbon barrel, but then they may put it in a barrel that's been used 3 or 4 times, and sometimes they eventually put it in a neutral cask, which means all the flavor from the wood is gone because it's been used so many times. So we actually are in the thresholds of bourbon barrels being sent to Scotland, which will see 100 years of use.
Mhm.
And there's actually a distiller local to Missouri that does something pretty cool. They start and they make a bourbon and they age it for 7 years in a new barrel. Then they age it for 7 years in a used bourbon barrel. Then they put it for 7 more years in a neutral barrel. And so their whiskeys are 20 to 23 years old. And they're no longer technically bourbons, even though it's a
Mhm.
bourbon recipe. And they're amazing because they don't have that over oak flavor profile. And they've spent that time in that neutral cask, which has pulled off some of those tannins, creating a more palatable or what
Interesting.
many would call a smoother finish. So there's a lot of things like that around the world that can be introduced to the whiskey making. So right now we are in a point with American whiskey that's really cool. If you can get beyond the bourbon traditionalists who say your bourbon's made this way and you can't do anything else with it, and you're open to other whiskey making styles. We have a new American single malt standard coming into
Mm.
play here shortly, for example. There's a lot of really cool things because when Angel's Envy, which was the first commercially available bourbon, I think finished it was in a port barrel. A lot of bourbon purists hated it because they're like it's no longer bourbon. And that's a semantic issue from a labeling perspective, but it's still pretty good, right?
Yep.
People love it. It's been
Mhm.
very successful. So this is where I tell people to drink curious and find something to really like. And I have to say, with that said, let's try this one because
Okay.
this fourth one falls contextually right in the middle of what you were just asking me.
Okay.
Now, this one, like I said, is darker than all the others. So once again, normally you might
Ooh.
be an age related. Sometimes there's something else in play.
Oh,
Now, you
that's
responded exactly how I
oh.
wanted you to
Now that's
on that
caramel
nose.
to me. That is
Yes.
wow. I could
Butterscotch,
yeah, I could pour that over
caramel,
ice cream.
chocolate. Now, there's a note in there that I get from anything that this company makes at any of their distilleries. There's a fruit note on that nose that I smell that I cannot shake. Do you smell anything unique fruit wise?
Banana.
Very good.
Mm.
Bananas.
Yep.
Ripe bananas, almost
Yep.
like banana bread, right? Um,
Yeah.
and
You could put
this
this on
is
some
the
banana bread with some ice cream.
bread pudding. And I tell people, play
Mm.
with your bourbon, right? This
Wow.
this is the best bourbon I've had to mix with a chocolate milkshake. Hands down.
Very
Hands
good.
down. So what you're drinking here, this is Woodford Reserve Double Oak Bourbon. So take regular Woodford,
Mhm.
right? Mature it, but don't put it in the bottle. They take another brand new barrel that's never been used. Before they char it, they toast it. And that toasting brings out soft, sweet oak characters, a little bit of cocoa, a little bit of marshmallow notes. They pour the bourbon back in. They let it sit for roughly 6 more months to create a radically different flavor profile. So I call this a very dessert forward,
Mhm.
sweeter style of bourbon. Dark caramel, hazelnut, apple spices on the palate. It is fantastic with desserts. Think like a
Mm.
dense chocolate cake or fudge, chocolate milkshake, bread pudding.
That's good.
I keep this in the house.
That's good.
Not only I put this in a lot of tastings for my clients, but I also keep it in my house for guests who come over and they say they don't like bourbon. I give them this on like a single cube for dessert, and they think it's a liqueur, and then I tell them it's bourbon, and they're like, "Wait, all bourbon doesn't taste like insert Jim Beam or whatever their dad used to drink." And suddenly it opens their eyes to possibilities. And now we're drinking curious.
Love it. Okay, I'm going to give you my ratings, okay? And
All
this is
right.
just rate. I'm just I'm rating these against each other, not giving them stars on how I feel about them. So I'm just
Sure.
rating them. So I gave number 1, the Wyoming whiskey, a 3. I gave Russell's Reserve a 3. I gave the Woodford Reserve Double Oak a 4, and I gave the Michener's Rye US 1 a 5
Fantastic.
on my scale.
Excellent. Excellent. And when we do these for our clients, we always ask, where do you rate them? And that's not far off where things are. We start them, and like I said, we started with the wheated bourbon. It's lighter,
Mm.
a little more approachable. We get into some a little more rustic. And then we start throwing the curveballs, right?
Yep.
Now we don't always use that Woodford Double Oak, but that Woodford Double Oak is a high rye bourbon once
It's
again.
good. I mean, the Woodford Double Oak. I mean, the only reason I gave it a 4 is to get some separation. But
Right.
it was outstanding. The Michener's Rye won me just because of the silkiness of it. The Double Oak, which I've had this before. I typically don't buy it because it's again, I don't know why I'm price sensitive, but there's a point for me where I'm just like you just passed my my number. But
Sure.
and this Double Oak has gotten expensive. I drink it when I'm at bars and when I'm out with clients.
Okay. Yeah.
But I've never had it like this. I usually have it on the rocks, and this is
Sure.
different. And I think
Yeah.
I think
Absolutely.
that what I've learned here is with the Double Oak in particular, it's better to drink this straight up versus
It's meant to be
yeah,
rich.
it's meant to be rich and with no water, no ice, just is almost an after dinner drink.
Mhm. Yeah. And, I've had people, I don't do this myself, but I have people who have told me that they've gone out and bought a bottle from one of my tastings and they put it in the freezer.
I
Now,
could
once
see
again,
that
a
cold.
purist would be all over me for that. But if that's how you like to drink it, man, go for it, right? You're not hurting the
I
whiskey.
could see this cold. I like my whiskey cold, so I could see this cold.
Mhm.
The Woodford Double Oak cold in in almost a cognac glass with a cigar
Sure.
after dinner would
Yeah.
be strong.
Absolutely.
It's just got that.
Absolutely.
It's got that feel. Excellent. Well done. This was
Yeah.
good. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. And then if you flip that bourbon flavor wheel over,
Okay.
we hope we inspire people. So that QR code that's on the back of that, that allows people to download their own bourbon
See?
flavor wheel and tasting mats and some different graphics. So if they want to invite some friends over and do a tasting themselves and show off what they've learned, they're going to have some nice materials to be able to do that with, which are kind
Awesome.
of fun, right?
Very good.
Because our old tagline was spreading the bourbon gospel, but since we do more than just bourbon, we've kind of moved on from that. But we just want to get people to kind of take a moment and pause and think about what they're drinking and explore other things that are out there. And then ultimately, for our clients, because obviously we're doing this for them as a business function, this is getting their clients as well to say, you know what, this was such a unique experience. It's oftentimes it's kicking the relationship off on the right foot and gives a story that they pass along as well. And obviously, it also gives them a nice intersection follow up point to say, hey, remember when we tasted this, or they can show up with the bottle. I've even had clients who will do one of these virtually a couple of weeks before they bring me out somewhere. To like I did one in Vegas where they rented out a cigar bar, and we did like a 200 level class there. And then just a couple of weeks ago, they brought me to their user conference where we did a tasting bar for 500 people.
Wow.
So you play the theme through a little bit, and you can get a lot of mileage out of it. Which come on, it's a lot of fun. It beats selling digital advertising.
I
I can tell
love
you
it.
that.
I love it. It's very good. And you can learn more and can you get the QR code at drinkcurious.com?
No, the QR code is something you get when you
You
attend one of
you
our
have to go
tastings.
to the tasting to get the QR code, so I'm hiding that from everybody. I love your logo, by the way. I think the logo is brilliant.
Oh, thank you.
So real quickly, uh, give us, before we go, 3
Mhm.
ways that people, businesses, companies, salespeople, leaders can leverage Curious and to sell more. 3 key
Sure,
ways.
absolutely. Absolutely. So the one way is if you have a company that has a lot of field marketers who are supporting your sales team. Um, you could be hosting 3 events a quarter, 40 events a quarter, but you're always in search of something that's going to get people's attention, breakthrough. With AI, which is fantastic, there's a lot of automated emails, a lot of things going out there. So how do you break through the attention? Our tastings provide that perfect hook to integrate, invite people to bourbon tasting, world of whiskeys tasting, Scotch tasting, tequila. So that's a fantastic way to integrate us into that hook, if you will, and invite us to that. So that is the number one reason and the biggest reason people are using us. So that's a fantastic way. We're also finding a lot of our clients as they have gotten back post COVID to attending in-person events at trade shows. They're not wanting to necessarily invest as much for on the floor activities. So they're turning to us to bring us in to do private executions, whether that's in a hotel suite, whether it's a restaurant or pub takeover. We have a great example of a client who used this extensively during COVID for happy hours to replace their in-person events. And we built such a reputation amongst their clientele now that every year we go out to the RSA conference in San Francisco and we do a pub takeover with a waiting list of 700 people.
Wow.
Once again, this people want to have this kind of experience. And then the third and the one that I find really fun is the smaller, intimate VIP gatherings. So once again, these can be online, but they can also be in person where you get together. We think about the selections a little bit differently, things that are a little bit more special, and can delve a little bit more into having those conversations about whiskey. And once again, you're inviting people to something that they necessarily can't get another way. So this could be a nice pairing dinner. So we'll work with chefs, venues across the country to create a really memorable special night that's going to leave them talking and kind of looking forward to the next interaction point.
I love it. I love it. I've had so much fun. This has been the best podcast. I haven't had this much fun on a podcast ever, and I've been podcasting for 17 years. And of course, you're the only guest that sent me whiskey uh, before the podcast started, so that helps a lot. And Pops, you've been a delight. Thank you so much. I hope
Thank
the
you.
people that are listening or watching who like bourbon learn something along the way. I certainly have, and I know that I'm heading. I hope I can find some Michener's Rye US1. I'm definitely gonna get that, and I'm going for the Woodford Double Oak as soon as I leave here on my way home. But thank you so much. And if you want to find out more about Pops, you can go to drinkcurious.com, and you can find you on Instagram at DrinkCurious and on LinkedIn at DrinkCurious. And I hope that you will, if you listen to this podcast, share it with your friends. Go check him out on at the website or on LinkedIn. Hashtag DrinkCurious to pump it up. Great story for an entrepreneur who you're kind of like me. One day you were working in a job, and one day they said you can't work here anymore, and you went out and found your own way. And I dig the grind and the heart that it takes to do that. I hope that we can do this again another time, because I really do like your alcohol. But thank you so much, Pops, for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having. It's been a blast. And you know what? I never get tired of talking to people about whiskey. And as I tell people, no one remembers an event for a salad. So think whiskey.
I love it. And listen, folks, you are our marketing arm. So word of mouth helps spread the word about the Sales Gravy podcast. We've been podcasting for 17 years. We are the granddaddy of all podcasts. Over 100 million downloads, but the only way we keep this going is you. So please do me a favor, go tell your friends, tell all the people that you work with, and give us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcast. And don't forget, on Sales Gravy University at learn.salesgravy.com, learn.salesgravy.com, if you've never taken a course, use the code FREECOURSE to get your very first course for free. We'll see you next time on the Sales Gravy podcast. Hey, I'm doing a happy dance because you watched this video. Make sure that you click like and subscribe so that you never miss one of our amazing sales training videos.